All right, everyone, here we go. No, here we don't go yet. Let's see. Let me page up. Get to the beginning of this lecture. Okay, I will try to go fast. I've got too many slides for you. I usually spend in the classroom at least one full week. That's 4 days talking, discussing, lecturing about the progressive movement. You're only going to get a few minutes here. Let's hopefully, fewer than too many, right? So there's a lot to say. And the answer to this question that you'll be discussing this week is multifaceted. It depends on what perspective you take. If you believe that the government can do positive things, if you like 8-hour day laws, if you like national parks and national forests, well, you might like the progressives. If you believe that corporations should be able to do whatever they want, that there should be no rules or regulations governing the marketplace, and that the government shouldn't be enforcing anti-monopoly laws and things like that, or enforcing railroad rate legislation, then you might think the progressives went too far. In a sense, the progressives are the first group in American political history, and when we talk about the progressives, we're talking about a couple presidents like the Republican Theodore Roosevelt and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. We're talking about reformers like Jane Addams, Alice Paul, women suffragettes. We're talking about a whole host of people that are involved in this movement, but as a whole, they were the first group to really begin to promote this idea that the government could solve many problems in American society. That doesn't mean that they gave up on individual responsibility. They didn't at all. Most of them were very moralistic, upstanding, responsible Protestant reformers. But they did believe that government could play a role. So how you answer this question depends on what perspective you take. If you like women's suffrage and the fact that women should be able to vote, then you might like the progressives because they got it done. If you like prohibition, you might like the progressives because they got that done too. But if you like a glass of beer or a glass of wine or even something harder on occasion, you might not like the progressives in all of their permutations. So it depends on how you look at it. If you look at it from the perspective of groups, if you look at it from the perspective of women, I think you could say that middle-class women at least were empowered by the progressive movement. If you look at it from the perspective of African Americans, I think you could say without much argument that progressive reformers at the national level did not pay much attention to African Americans, and even though African Americans themselves, as you read about in your book, people like W.E.B. Du Bois and the Niagara Movement and the creation of the NAACP began to advocate for black civil rights during this period of segregation and widespread racism both north and south, and that would be institutionalized racism, laws which differentially treated blacks and whites, that in this period presidents like Wilson, a Democrat from the North, and Roosevelt, a Republican from the North, did not pay much attention or concern themselves that much with African American issues, wouldn't even go as far as to go out on a limb against lynching. Oh yes, what a very controversial stance to take, right, at the turn of the century for an American politician to say that lynching is wrong. Well, so there you go. If you look at it from the perspective of African Americans, I don't think it's much of a success. Life doesn't change that much for them. Well, very quickly, let's look at all the different forms and facets and permutations of what progressivism is. If you don't like paying taxes or income taxes, you might not like the progressives. And yet if you recognize that income taxes are, an important part of having a functioning government, well, then you might say it's reasonable. And in fact, you'd be surprised, but the income tax had great popular political support in 1913 when it was passed. It could never have passed through both houses of Congress with 3/4 and passed in 3/4 of the states, or I mean with 2/3 in Congress and then 3/4 of the states. Remember, that's what you have to do to get a constitutional amendment passed. It had tremendous popular support by people who at the turn of the 20th century believed that American society had become divided too much between the very rich and the very poor. The income tax seemed to be a solution to that for many. The direct election of senators, if you like the fact that we elect our senators directly from the people, well, this is a change, because if you look at the Constitution, the election of senators was not in the hands of the people, and it had to take a constitutional amendment. The 17th, these are all, by the way, constitutional amendments. The 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, which provides that the people can actually elect senators. Previous to that, every state did it differently, but mostly elites or the parties themselves chose who the senators would be. So this is an incredibly democratic type of reform. There's prohibition and women's suffrage. These are the big constitutional amendments that occur during the Progressive era. Just on the basis of, well, did they get things done? I think one thing we could really say is, yes, they got things done. So if you want to say success is manifested in getting things done, then you could also say that the progressives are successful just on that score. Look at this, 4 big constitutional amendments and many, many more things to come in all areas of life. Corporate regulation. This is one of the types of reforms that the progressive movement promoted. The idea being that corporations controlled politicians, that corporations were the strongest and most powerful entity in the country. They did what they wanted. Here you see the Standard Oil Trust, the Copper Trust, the Steel Beam Trust, and so forth, sitting in the chambers of the Senate. And so there was this idea that the people were vulnerable to these very, very powerful interests, the so-called robber barons. And so progressives like Teddy Roosevelt set out to whip the trusts into line. Here's Roosevelt depicted as a very muscular character, which he was, a very athletic character depicted here in the classical kind of 19th century swimming suit, brandishing a whip, packing some heat, and whipping the lines of Wall Street into compliance. Political reform, such as initiative, referendum, and recall, which gave people the vote. The people could legislate instead of the parties, which were controlled by bosses, urban bosses, political machines that operated much like the mafia. Women's suffrage, direct election of senators, which I've already mentioned, both of those things, that was political reform. And you can see here a map of women's suffrage also depicted in your book. Other examples, the Australian ballot, which is the secret ballot. Before the progressive era, there was no secret ballot. Everyone knew who you were going to vote for. Well, that really dampened efforts of reformers. If you wanted to step outside your party orthodoxy and challenge the existing power structure in your community, it was very hard to do so, because if you lived in a northern city, in an immigrant community, just a second, I have a phone call. Wow. Okay.